October 25th, 1944, 7:35 a.m., Philippine Sea. Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on the bridge of the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing barely 2,700 tons, and watched the horizon fill with Japanese warships. Not cruisers, not destroyers, battleships. 4 of them, massive steel fortresses, each one outweighing his ship 10 times over. Their main guns, 18-inch monsters, capable of hurling shells the weight of small cars over 20 miles, were already turning toward his position. Behind them, the entire Japanese center force, the largest naval armada assembled since Midway, 23 warships total. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all of them hunting for one thing, the American escort carriers supporting the invasion of Leyte Gulf. Evans didn't have time to count the enemy ships. He didn't need to. He could see what was about to happen. The Japanese fleet would sweep past him, destroy the defenseless carriers behind him, massacre the troops on the beaches, and possibly change the entire outcome of the Pacific War. His destroyer, armed with 5 5-inch guns that would bounce off battleship armor like pebbles, was all that stood between catastrophe and the American fleet. The officer next to him spoke quietly. "Captain, we're dead if we engage. Those battleships will crush us." Evans looked at the enemy fleet, then at his crew, then back at the Japanese armada bearing down on them at 30 knots. He gave the order that should have been suicide. Commence firing, all ahead flank, prepare for torpedo attack. The USS Johnston turned directly toward the Japanese fleet and charged. This is the story of how one U.S. destroyer defeated 4 Japanese battleships, how 327 men on a ship that shouldn't have survived 10 minutes bought enough time to save an entire invasion force, how courage, sacrifice, and impossible odds collided in what historians now call the greatest naval battle in history. This is the story of the Battle off Samar, and it begins with a man who refused to run. To understand what happened on October 25, 1944, you need to understand what the Japanese were trying to do. By late 1944, Japan was losing the war. American forces had leapfrogged across the Pacific, capturing island after island. The Philippines, once a Japanese conquest, now about to be liberated, represented Japan's last defensive line. Lose the Philippines, and the war was effectively over. The Japanese High Command knew this. So they devised a plan, a desperate all-or-nothing gamble called Shogo, or Victory Operation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Lure the American Third Fleet away from the Philippines using Japanese aircraft carriers as bait. While the Americans chased the carriers north, the real strike force, the center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, would slip through the central Philippines and attack the vulnerable amphibious forces landing troops at Leyte Gulf. It almost worked perfectly. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, took the bait. On the night of October 24th, he steamed north with every battleship, carrier, and cruiser under his command, chasing the Japanese carrier force. He left behind only one group to protect the landing beaches, Taffy 3. Taffy 3 wasn't a battle fleet. It was 6 escort carriers, small, slow aircraft carriers designed for submarine hunting, not surface combat. Their aircraft carried depth charges and small bombs meant for submarines, not warships. Escorting them were 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. No battleships, no cruisers, no heavy armor. And on the morning of October 25th, they found themselves facing the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left. The USS Johnston was part of Taffy 3's screen. Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma and one of the Navy's few Native American officers, had taken command of Johnston in 1943. He was known for aggressive tactics and inspiring leadership. During the ship's commissioning ceremony, he told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. And on October 25th, they'd discover exactly what harm's way meant. At 6:45 a.m., lookouts on Johnston spotted the pagoda-like masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon. At first, they thought it might be friendly ships. Then came the identification: Yamato-class battleships, Congo-class battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, the entire Japanese center force, 23 warships, and they were 18 miles away and closing fast. Rear Admiral Clifton Spragg, commanding Taffy 3, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His escort carriers couldn't outrun battleships. Their aircraft weren't armed for surface combat. His escorts were outgunned 50-1. In naval terms, this wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Spragg had minutes to make a decision. He ordered the escort carriers to run south, making smoke to hide their retreat. He launched every aircraft he had, even those armed with nothing but machine guns and depth charges. Then he did something that seemed insane. He ordered his destroyers to attack. Not to delay, not to harass, to attack, to charge directly at a fleet that could sink them with single salvos. Commander Evans didn't wait for the order to be repeated. At 7:10 a.m., before any other ship in Taffy 3 moved, Johnston broke formation and charged the Japanese fleet alone. The distance between Johnston and the Japanese fleet closed rapidly, 18 miles, 15 miles, 12 miles. Evans pushed his ship to flank speed, 35 knots, every turbine screaming. Black smoke poured from the stacks as engineers fed the boilers everything they had. The crew knew what was coming. They'd trained for surface combat, but nothing prepares you for charging 4 battleships. At 7:15 a.m., Johnston opened fire. Her 5-inch guns, designed primarily for anti-aircraft work, began hammering shells toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. The range was extreme, over 10 miles, but Evans wanted to draw fire away from the carriers. He wanted the Japanese to focus on him instead of the helpless escort carriers behind him. It worked. The Japanese fleet responded with overwhelming force. 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo started falling around Johnston. They created geysers of water 300 feet high. Then 18-inch shells from the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, joined in. Each shell weighed over 3,000 pounds. A single hit would break Johnston in half. Evans didn't flinch. He ordered evasive maneuvers while maintaining course directly toward the enemy. Johnston zigzagged through the forest of shell splashes, somehow avoiding direct hits. Her 5-inch guns never stopped firing. At 9,000 yards, just over 5 miles, Johnston entered torpedo range. Evans had 10 Mark 15 torpedoes. Against battleships with armor belts 16 inches thick, torpedoes were his only real weapon. But to launch them effectively, he had to close even further, had to bring his ship into point-blank range of guns that could vaporize him. He kept charging. At 7:24 a.m., at a range of 10,000 yards, Johnston launched her entire torpedo spread, 10 torpedoes fanning out toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. Then Evans did something extraordinary. Instead of retreating behind smoke, he maintained course toward the Japanese fleet, using his 5-inch guns to suppress enemy fire and keep their attention. The torpedoes ran true. Several struck Kumano, blowing off her bow and knocking her out of the battle. The heavy cruiser, one of Japan's most powerful warships, limped away, trailing oil and listing heavily. One destroyer had crippled a heavy cruiser. But Johnston had painted a target on herself. Every Japanese ship in range opened fire. At 7:30 a.m., 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck Johnston almost simultaneously. One penetrated the bridge, killing several officers and wounding Commander Evans. Shrapnel tore through his hand and chest. Another shell destroyed the aft fire room, killing everyone inside. The third knocked out the after steering engine room. Johnston shuddered under the impacts. Power failed throughout the ship. The bridge filled with smoke and the screams of wounded men. For a moment, it seemed like she was finished. But Evans, bleeding from multiple wounds, refused to abandon his post. He transferred steering control to the aft steering compartment. Engineers worked miracles keeping the engines running. Damage control parties sealed flooding compartments while under fire. Within minutes, Johnston was back in action, her remaining guns still firing. If you're enjoying this journey through history, remember to subscribe to WW2 Last Stand, where we bring forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands of World War II back to life. Evans looked at his damaged ship and his wounded crew. He could have retreated into the smokescreen, trying to save what was left of Johnston.
Nobody would have blamed him. He'd already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. Instead, he spotted Japanese destroyers moving to attack the escort carriers. He turned Johnston directly toward them and charged again. By 8 a.m., the battle off Samar had become complete chaos. The other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 had joined the fight, following Johnston's example. They charged the Japanese fleet, launching torpedoes and firing their small guns, desperately trying to buy time for the escort carriers. Aircraft from the carriers, armed with whatever they could carry, bombs, depth charges, even just machine guns, strafed Japanese ships repeatedly. The Japanese, supremely confident just an hour earlier, found themselves under relentless attack from all directions. Torpedoes forced their battleships to maneuver defensively instead of pursuing the carriers. Constant air attacks disrupted their fire control. Small destroyers dodged in and out of smoke screens, appearing and disappearing, creating confusion about American strength. Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force from the battleship Yamato, became convinced he was facing a much larger force than he actually was. The aggressive American attacks didn't match the behavior of a defeated fleeing fleet. Maybe Halsey had returned. Maybe this was a trap. Meanwhile, Johnston continued fighting, despite catastrophic damage. Her after magazines were flooded. 2 of her 5 guns were destroyed. Her speed had dropped to 17 knots. Multiple fires burned below deck. Casualties mounted steadily. But she kept firing, keep maneuvering, keep fighting. At 8:20 a.m., Evans spotted a formation of Japanese destroyers preparing to launch torpedoes at the escort carrier Gambier Bay. Johnston, barely operational, turned to intercept. She charged directly toward the destroyers, guns blazing, daring them to fight her instead of attacking the carriers. The Japanese destroyers, confused by Johnston's aggressive tactics, turned away to engage her. They surrounded the damaged American destroyer, pounding her with gunfire from multiple directions. Shell after shell slammed into Johnston's hull. The forward stack was shot away. The superstructure became a twisted wreck of steel. Fire spread throughout the ship. By 9 o'clock a.m., Johnston was dying. Over half her crew was dead or wounded. All power was failing. The ship was listing heavily, taking on water faster than the pumps could manage. Commander Evans, barely conscious from his wounds, knew the end had come. He gave the order to abandon ship. Survivors later recalled the haunting calm of those final moments. Men helped wounded shipmates over the side. They inflated life rafts while under fire. Some refused to leave their stations until Evans personally ordered them off. The ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, had to physically carry Evans to the side of the ship. At 9:45 a.m., the USS Johnston rolled over and sank. She'd fought for 2.5 hours against impossible odds. She'd crippled a heavy cruiser, driven off multiple destroyers, and drawn fire away from the escort carriers at every opportunity. She'd bought time, precious, irreplaceable time. And that time made all the difference. At 9:25 a.m., Admiral Kurita made a decision that shocked his officers. Despite having the American escort carriers within range, despite being on the verge of complete victory, he ordered the center force to withdraw. The Japanese fleet turned around and retreated. Historians still debate why Kurita withdrew. The most likely explanation, he believed he was facing a much stronger American force than actually existed. The ferocious resistance from ships like Johnston convinced him that Halsey's main fleet had returned. The confusion of battle, the constant air attacks, the aggressive destroyer charges, all of it created the illusion of strength where there was only desperation. Kurita had defeated Taffy 3 tactically. He'd sunk the escort carrier Gambier Bay, 2 destroyers and a destroyer escort. He damaged multiple other ships. But strategically, he'd been defeated by sheer courage. The suicidal charges of destroyers like Johnston had disrupted his formation, delayed his advance, and ultimately convinced him that victory was impossible. The battle off Samar was over. The Japanese center force withdrew, never reaching the landing beaches at Leyte Gulf. The American invasion continued. The Philippines would be liberated. Japan's defensive perimeter collapsed. All because a handful of destroyers refused to run. But the cost was staggering. Of Johnston's crew of 327 men, Only 141 survived. Commander Ernest Evans was not among them. He was last seen on the bridge as Johnston sank, refusing assistance, ensuring his men got off first. His body was never recovered. The survivors spent hours in the water, under the burning tropical sun, waiting for rescue. Some died from wounds, others from exposure or shark attacks. Japanese destroyers passed close enough to see them, but, in a rare moment of respect, Japanese sailors saluted the American survivors instead of firing on them. It would take 2 days for rescue ships to reach all the survivors. When they finally came aboard American vessels, many broke down, not just from exhaustion or relief, but from the memory of what they'd witnessed, what they'd done, what their ship and their captain had accomplished. The Battle off Samar shocked the U.S. Navy. When Admiral Halsey learned what had happened, that Taffy 3 had faced the entire Japanese center force alone, he couldn't believe it. When he learned that destroyers had charged battleships and survived long enough to drive them off, he called it impossible. But it happened, and the evidence was undeniable. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism against an armed enemy, Commander Evans gallantly gave his life in the service of his country." The USS Johnston received the Presidential Unit Citation. Every surviving crew member received the Navy Cross or Silver Star. Their story became legend in the Navy, the destroyer that charged 4 battleships and lived long enough to win. But more importantly, Johnston's sacrifice represented something fundamental about the Battle off Samar. This wasn't a story of superior technology or overwhelming force. It was a story of ordinary men facing impossible odds and choosing to fight anyway. Of destroyers that should have been crushed in minutes, lasting hours. Of aircraft attacking with nothing but machine guns because it was all they had. Of sailors who knew they were going to die and fought harder because of it. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, later wrote, "In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 7:30 and 9:30 off Samar." Japanese officers who survived the battle remembered it differently. They remembered being terrified by destroyers that wouldn't die. They remembered the confusion, the chaos, the sense that they were fighting a force much larger than what they could see. They remembered retreating when they should have won. The story of how one U.S. destroyer defeated 4 Japanese battleships isn't just about Johnston, though her role was crucial. It's about what happens when courage meets impossible circumstances. It's about the power of aggressive action even in the face of certain death. It's about buying time, precious minutes and hours that change everything. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, later wrote, "In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 7:30 and 9:30 off Samar." Japanese officers who survived the battle remembered it differently. They remembered being terrified by destroyers that wouldn't die. They remembered the confusion, the chaos, the sense that they were fighting a force much larger than what they could see. They remembered retreating when they should have won. The story of how one U.S. destroyer defeated 4 Japanese battleships isn't just about Johnston, though her role was crucial. It's about what happens when courage meets impossible circumstances. It's about the power of aggressive action even in the face of certain death. It's about buying time, precious minutes and hours that change everything.
Today, the waters off Samar are calm. The wreckage of Johnston lies 3.5 miles deep, discovered only in 2019 by a research expedition. The bridge where Commander Evans made his fateful decision is crushed by pressure, silent in the darkness. But the story of what happened there echoes through naval history. When students at the Naval Academy study surface warfare tactics, they study Samar. When destroyermen talk about their ship's legacy, they invoke Johnston's name. When anyone asks what it means to go in harm's way, the motto of the destroyer force, the answer is always the same. October 25, 1944, the Battle off Samar, the day destroyers charged battleships and won. We remember Commander Ernest Evans, who refused to abandon his post even as his ship disintegrated around him.
We remember the 186 men of Johnston who died that morning. We remember the engineers who kept the engines running while shells tore through the hull. We remember the gunners who fired until their weapons were destroyed. We remember the sailors who helped wounded shipmates into life rafts while the ship sank beneath them. We remember because their sacrifice mattered. Because without Johnston's suicidal charge, the Japanese fleet would have reached the escort carriers. Without those precious minutes Johnston bought, thousands of American sailors would have died, and the invasion of Leyte Gulf might have failed. One ship, 327 men, and 2.5 hours of impossible courage changed the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese planned to win through overwhelming force. They lost because they faced something stronger than battleships and bigger than guns, the human spirit refusing to surrender, even when survival is impossible. Johnston didn't defeat 4 Japanese battleships through firepower. She defeated them through pure fighting spirit, through the refusal to accept defeat, through the choice to charge when anyone rational would have run, through the understanding that some things are worth dying for. That lesson echoes across decades. In every crisis, when the odds seem impossible and defeat looks certain, we remember Johnston. We remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's charging forward despite fear. That heroes aren't people without doubt, they're people who act despite doubt. That victory isn't guaranteed by strength, it's earned by those who refuse to quit. The USS Johnston was just one destroyer, but on October 25, 1944, for 2.5 impossible hours, she was everything. And her legacy, the memory of what ordinary men can accomplish in extraordinary circumstances, lives on. They charged 4 battleships with a destroyer, and somehow, impossibly, they won. The stories of heroes like Commander Evans and the crew of USS Johnston deserve to be told and retold. Subscribe to WW2 Last Stand for more forgotten battles, incredible acts of courage, and the untold stories that shaped history.